Hello everybody and welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Photography. Welcome to module number 2, your intermediate module in photography. Did you know one of the largest photographs ever made, this gigantic panoramic photo of Mont Blanc, can be viewed at www.intowhite.com. This is something that I urge you to check out after this lesson. Of course, it is an incredible feat of photography. It's a gigantic 365 gigapixels, and it was made by combining multiple exposures, multiple photographs together. There's a great video on how they did it. It's hard to describe. You'd have to see it, just how much detail is in it and how much you can zoom in, just how big the photograph actually is. Now, every time I do these lessons, it seems like a new bigger photograph comes out, so there is always going to be bigger and bigger photographs coming out as the years go by. It's really interesting to see what photographers are doing in terms of pushing the size of the photographs that they produce. But this one is a really great one to have a look at. So after the lesson, of course, do check it out and have a little bit of fun with that. So you are on module number 2 as usual. I just want to encourage you to keep going with your lessons. You will see an improvement every single lesson that you attend. Hopefully after the first lesson you saw in module 2 all about portraiture, you're getting out there and you're seeing an improvement in your portrait photography and hopefully feeling a little bit more confident about taking photographs of people. As usual, you can interact with me throughout these lessons through Morpheus, and please do remember to rate all the responses. Any questions that you ask here, we do see them all. They do go into Morpheus' database so that we can improve the quality of the answers. We always try to get back to every student as possible as well if we don't get a chance to answer your questions in the lessons. So, moving on into this lesson, we're going to have a look at how to take better landscape photographs. And landscape photography is probably one of the first areas most photographers will get into because it's something that you can do on your own. It's something that you can take time to practice and get familiar with your camera. And there's a therapy to being out there photographing on your own and beginning to explore the world around you in an entirely new way. And some people become absolutely obsessed with landscape photography and they want to make it a career for themselves. It is a difficult area to make a career out of. It's not impossible and it can be very, very rewarding. However, landscape photography is actually one of the most technical areas in photography. While on the surface it might appear quite straightforward, to really get amazing, dynamic, interesting landscapes that kind of stand apart from, other photographs that people may be taking of the same area, it requires a lot of work, and that's what we're going to be digging into within this lesson. But the very first thing you need to get right is to get yourself prepared properly. You really, really need to be using the right equipment so that you're not out there and you're not feeling like that. Well, first of all, you're not prepared in terms of the lenses, the camera, everything that you have with you, or even just having the right kind of clothes on. So it's time to get our hiking boots or walking boots on and get out there, spend a little bit of time in the great outdoors. And the very first thing that you're going to want to invest in, and I'm sure that you already have, is some type of bag or some type of backpack. Now, there is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of bags out there and different types of brands out there, and years ago when I used to work in camera shops, we used to just have these walls just full of bags hanging off them. And customers would come in and they would always try to find that one magic bag that was able to do everything, that was somehow able to carry 7 different lenses and cameras and yet still be very small and very portable. It doesn't exist. You are going to need to have multiple bags. You'll probably find that you pick up a few different bags over the course of your photography journey. But there is just so many different types available. There is just so many different brands, as I mentioned, so many different ones designed to suit your needs. Shoulder bags are great for street and urban photography. So these are the types of ones that would sling over your shoulder, and they're designed for easy and quick access. The problem with those kinds of bags is that they're not really great for carrying a huge amount of weight, because if you're going to be putting pressure on your back. And especially if you're doing a lot of hiking or anything like that, you definitely would need to be using a backpack instead. Now, a lot of backpacks out there are designed to try and have a quick access. They often have a side panel that you can just reach around and you can unzip, and you can quickly access items and lenses, whatever it is that you need at that particular time. But you will be looking at spending more money on backpacks. In the long run, obviously, they are far better for your back, as they distribute the weight a lot more evenly than if you were using a shoulder bag. Many bags have durable rainproof coating. Some will also have rain covers that you can actually pull out from the bottom and will go over in torrential rain. If I was to recommend a brand, I suppose the brand that's kind of synonymous with backpacks are Low Pro. They just have every type of bag that you could possibly think, and they have that outer casing that's soft, but is designed to have the rain just kind of fall off it, but it's not completely impermeable. But a lot of them will have rain covers that you can pull over as well. So that's the first thing that you want to make sure that you have good, is a good bag. Then with landscape photography, pretty much a must, and really something that every photographer should have, is a tripod. Now, I'm sure most of you have a tripod and a bag already. Particularly with tripods, it rings very, very true, that old adage that if you buy cheap, you buy twice. And I'm speaking from a huge amount of experience here. So in particular, with plastic tripods, if you happen to be using one now that may suit your needs for the moment, it is recommended that you eventually go up to one of the metal or the carbon fiber ones. But again, onto the types of available, they are universal, so they will fit any camera. The threads are universal across the board on cameras. Some tripods can be very basic, can be very, very small. Some can be very complex with interchangeable heads on them, like the Manfrotto types that we can see here. There is lots of different materials available, but the main ones would be plastic, aluminium, or aluminum, whatever way you decide you want to pronounce that, and carbon fiber. Plastic are useful in the sense that they're light, they're not durable, they will break. I have gone through a lot of plastic tripods in my time. Aluminium are very durable, but are very heavy. I bought an aluminium one well over a decade ago. I still have it. It still works very, very well, but it is an absolute monster to carry around. And carbon fiber, they would be a good combination. They are light, they can take a lot of weight, but they are expensive because that material is expensive to produce. So do consider weight, as you're going to carry it around a lot. So the main thing I would really recommend when it comes to tripod is don't buy them blindly. While you can get deals online, it's definitely recommended that you take time. If you can, go and visit a local camera shop and actually test it out. Because if you're using a big camera, for example, like a Nikon D850, and you've got a 70 to 200 millimeter lens on it, that is a lot of weight. You don't want to be putting that onto something that isn't going to be able to carry a top heavy lens combination and camera combination like that, because it's just going to go over. So it is recommended that you go in and that you spend a little bit of time and try to get the best tripod that your budget will allow. Okay, but they are pretty much going to be essential when it comes to landscape photography. The next thing that you may want to carry around with you are ND filters, neutral density filters. Now, I won't be going in depth into neutral density filters in this lesson. We will have an entire lesson all about the different types of filters coming up in the next module, and going in depth into exactly what they each do. But basically, a neutral density filter can attach to the lens, either screw onto the front of the lens or through an adapter set, and will allow you to increase exposure time. So if you want to get those long exposures during the daytime, to get clouds moving, to get nice silky effect on water, you will be looking at using a neutral density filter. Different densities, different stops are available. So again, we'll be going into this in more detail at a later stage, but an ND2 filter would add a stop darkness to your photography. An ND4 filter would add 2 stops, an ND8 will add 3 stops, and so on. If you are looking for a good one to begin with, I do think an ND8 filter is a good one to start with, because it'll give you those 3 stops, which will be plenty time to get longer exposures, but you can also still balance that out if you want to, say, only reduce it by 2 or by 1 stops by changing your settings. Okay, so again, good idea to go and visit a local camera shop for a little bit more advice on these, and there's good systems you can check out. We will be looking at them much more in detail in future. Okay, so then finally, the next thing you may look at, if you're really going to be out there a lot, and if you're in a climate very much like Ireland or the UK, where there's a lot of rain, a lot of changeable weather, you may want to look at investing in a rain cover. Similarly, if you're in locations that are very humid, so say for example you're lucky enough to take a trip to the Amazon, you're going to be in very, very humid conditions with a lot of moisture. Rain covers will be something very much to think about. So they protect your camera from precipitation. You can see that they have these kind of holes in them that will allow you to still be able to operate the camera and to change your settings. And a good one to check out there, you can see them in the bottom there, are Think Tank. You will be spending a little bit more money on them, but they're very, very good at keeping the rain off your camera. And one last thing, don't forget about yourself. Make sure you are wearing the correct clothes. You want to keep warm, you want to keep comfortable, you want to wear rain gear, and you also want to, probably the most important thing, you want to wear the correct footwear, because you're going to be out there walking a lot. And one thing that you may not think about, but it would also be very, very important, is to bring sunscreen as well. If you're out there all day, even on cloudy days, you can actually still get sunburned. So do bring a little bit of sunscreen for yourself as well, for a little bit of skin protection too. Good, now we're all prepared. Next thing is, where are we going to shoot? And also very important, when are we going to shoot? Okay, so when you are choosing a location to go and photograph, you really also need to consider the time of day that you're going to photograph it at as well. Generally midday is not considered a great time of the day to photograph, but it can vary depending on what part of the world you happen to be in. But these next couple of slides, we're going to have a look at just some general tips that you should take into account when you're choosing a location, and just other things to be aware of as well. And then a little bit later on, we'll have a look at how to actually get sharper landscape photographs. So the first thing that I would recommend that you do, it's obviously all about your location. Do your research first. Spend a little bit of time planning, and also make sure to plan for the weather as well. Be sure that you have a decent weather app on your phone, or that you've just had a good look at the weather forecast the night before. Have a look at the area that you're photographing. Is it somewhere that's easily accessible? Is it going to require a lot of time to get to that location? Is there going to be a lot of other people around at that time of day, and so on? So you want to make sure that you're well prepared, so that you don't just randomly go somewhere and find that, loads of people at it, or it doesn't, or it's actually a very difficult place to get to. Just do your research first. Start local to practice. There's no need to travel very far. So think about your local environment. Think about what's around you. Now, you might be very familiar with it. It might seem kind of boring and mundane and everyday to you, but that's because you live in it. But a landscape is kind of unique in a sense that if I was to show you a photograph of my local area, you could think that it looks amazing because you're not familiar with it. So just because you might find it a little bit boring, a little bit difficult to photograph where you're living, it doesn't mean that someone else might not find it very, very interesting to look at those photographs. So do start local. Think about the environment that's around you, whether that's a local park, maybe you're close to the seaside, maybe you are in a very built up environment. You can still photograph all of these landscapes. It's a really good way to practice. Start with simple compositions, and remember the rule of thirds. So think back to our composition lesson in module 1 and keep things nice and straightforward at the beginning. The rule of thirds is particularly effective when it comes to landscape photography, so do bear that in mind. But have a look out for other things like symmetry, try some central compositions to kind of mix things up as well. Be aware of what's happening in the foreground as well as in the background. And also, a landscape photograph doesn't always just have to be in a landscape format. You can also shoot a landscape photograph in a portrait format as well. Bring a tripod, kind of goes without saying really when it comes to landscape photography, because you want to practice those longer exposures. Start with lower ISOs. Again, this is something you'll hear me say over and over and over again. Always start with lower ISOs. If you have a tripod, there isn't any real need to go with higher ISOs, because you're going to be able to take your time with your exposures and make sure that everything is nice and clean and sharp. And do experiment with your settings. I mean, you're in a situation, unless you're kind of struggling a little bit to get the right light, like if you're photographing early in the morning and you're a little bit worried that you haven't got a huge amount of time in terms of the quality of the light, otherwise you can take a bit of time to experiment with your settings. It's a great way to get familiar with your equipment and what your camera is able to do. And if you're like me and you live in a country where there's a lot of cloudy weather a lot of the time, that doesn't mean that you can't still go out and take photographs. Cloudy days are a great way to practice. They're a great way to find locations. You can go out and you can explore. You might find an area that you look at the picture and be like, okay, well, this is going to be something that I definitely need to revisit. Now, so in terms of the time of day you should be photographing, get up early. Light is better early in the morning or late in the afternoon. As I mentioned, shooting midday isn't always really the best time of day to photograph. Shadows tend to be very, very short. They also tend to be quite hard as well. You tend to get a harder light at midday. The light is overhead, so everything can kind of look a little bit either very contrasty or sometimes very, very flat, depending, on the cloud cover as well. So early in the morning or late in the evening, the sun is at a lower angle, give you nicer shadows, but you'll also get nicer colours in the sky as well. If you're doing a full day shoot, do be prepared properly. So if you're getting up early and you're planning on photographing all the way into the evening, wear the right clothes, make sure that you're well stocked, bring plenty of food and water with you. And if you can, bring a companion, bring somebody with you, and definitely notify someone of where you are going to be. You don't want to just disappear for the day off into a forest where something may happen to you without someone either being with you or without at least telling somebody of where you are going to go. Vary the height that you photograph at. So as you start to experiment with your compositions, don't just shoot everything from eye level. Don't just have that tripod set up at the same height every single time. Getting higher, getting lower is how you discover to photograph a landscape in a way that nobody else has photographed it, and that's what's going to make your photograph stand out and make it unique from all the other photographs that may be taken in that particular landscape. So remember just to vary the height a little bit. You'd be surprised at the effect that it can have. And do be aware of the foreground, be aware of things like rocks and that in the foreground, that they might be able to be used to add a little bit more perspective, a little bit more depth to the scene. Revisit an area frequently. So you can see as we're going on with these slides, we're going from quite basic setups, quite basic information to information that's, if you're really getting into your landscape photography, that you're developing a habit and a practice for yourself. When you photograph an area, it's very unlikely that you're going to get the best of that area in one shot or in one visit. Revisit an area frequently, because well, you might not get that shot on that day. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get it the next day or the day after or the week after or the month after. Don't be deterred. Keep going back and get it. Revisit seasonally as well. So light and weather changes throughout the year. So landscape change as well. So obviously, if you're photographing somewhere with a lot of flowers that may bloom in the spring and the early summer, it could look completely different in the late winter. But it's a good idea to go and revisit these areas frequently, throughout the seasons as well, and kind of build up a nice portfolio of that area as it changes throughout the year. The world is really diverse. Think about landscapes. There's so many different types of landscapes out there. Do travel. So when you start to really get into your landscape photography, you're definitely going to want to get out there and to travel. Do start locally, as I mentioned, but when you get the bug, you're going to want to get out there and you're really going to want to travel. So do check out things like groups that go and organise photographic holidays and so on. They can be great to discover new areas. Not all landscapes have to be stunning and amazing and pretty and beautiful. Landscapes can show how we have impacted the world. They can show the negative impact, that's happening in the world through development. So, for example, if a motorway is being built through a landscape, that could be something that you should photograph. The industrialization of rivers, it could be something to photograph. So, landscapes can be very, very broad. Photographing cities, a city is a landscape. It's an environment that's created by humans, but it's still a landscape. So think outside the box when you're thinking of your landscapes. And then finally, the last few tips. One I mentioned briefly: organise a photography holiday with friends or a group. And this is a really great one. So you'll find loads of these online. You'll find most likely, no matter what region or territory you happen to be living in, there is probably someone that offers this type of service where you can go on a holiday with a group of other photographers. It's like a package kind of thing, and they'll usually go to places like, say, Iceland, places like Prague is a very popular place for photographers to go and visit. And they can be really, really great because you get a chance to interact with a community of photographers who generally all be at the same level as you as well. If you're photographing a night in the city, definitely advise to bring somebody with you. So photographing landscapes at night, whether it's in a city or whether, it's just at night in general, you should have somebody with you. I have certainly photographed at night and I have been approached, and it can be intimidating. So I recommend that you definitely bring somebody with you if you're photographing at night. Invest in a UV filter, a polarizing filter, and an ND filter when you do get more advanced. You may have UV filters already. These are really just for protection for the lens. They do serve a function. We'll look at it in a later lesson. Polarizing filter is also very, very useful. They're complex. Again, we'll talk about them at a later stage. And then our neutral density filters, we mentioned them a little bit briefly. And then the final thing I'll mention for the time being in relation to this is to photograph in RAW and JPEG. If you're not already photographing in RAW, you will need to start considering it at this stage. Phones capture in RAW as well. It really is becoming a much more accessible type of file to use. RAW requires a little bit of work to get the most out of them. Something we're going to have a look at in module 4, which is all going to be about how to use RAW files in post-production. Something really to look forward to. But you will want to use those files. While you may not be using them right now, you're definitely going to want to have those RAW files for the future. Okay, now, so like we had a look at in our portrait photography lesson, we had to look at some portrait techniques. Well, let's have a look at some landscape techniques then to improve the quality of our landscape photography. And the main thing that you're trying to achieve with a landscape, in most cases, now obviously it's completely down to how you want to capture that landscape, but we want to try and get as sharp as photograph as possible. We want to have everything that's in the foreground and everything that's all the way in the background to be as sharp as we can get it. That does not mean photographing on f/22. as we're going to see. Okay, so the first thing is, what type of lens should we be using for landscapes? Now, again, you can use pretty much any type of lens that you want, any lens that's available to you, but ideally you're going to be wanting to use either wide angle or ultra wide angle lenses. And I'm talking about lenses that would have a range of about 10 to 40 millimeters. Now, I'm not going into fisheye. I don't think fisheye lenses are great for landscape photography, really, because of the amount of distortion that you get on them afterwards. Really isn't. They're really not suitable for that type of photography. But wide angle lenses, they offer a dynamic view of the world. Remember, wide angle lenses are wider than our own focused field of vision. So when we photograph with a wide angle lens, you want to make sure that you're first of all running your eye around the edges to make sure that there's nothing, kind of in the edges of the frame that you may have missed. But you're also seeing the view of the world in a different way, in a way that you're not normally used to seeing it. Very wide angle lenses will have distortion at the edges. This will need to be corrected in post-production. It's unavoidable. A lot of cameras now have in-lens corrections, like Olympus cameras. They'll actually correct that kind of thing at the time of exposure. I actually prefer to do it afterwards. We will have a look at how to do that in our final module. There'll be a whole lesson on how to edit our landscape photos correctly. This is also why I don't think a fisheye lens is very good for landscape photography at all. The distortion is just too extreme. It is possible to edit a fisheye lens image to get it looking relatively normal, but I think our standard kind of wide angle lenses are a much better way to go. Zoom lenses can offer options but will be less sharp. Now remember, when I'm talking about zoom lenses, I'm not talking about a telephoto lens. I'm talking about a lens that has a variable focal length. So your 18 to 55 millimeters, or your 24 to 70 millimeters. These types of lenses are great lenses to use, but they're just lacking that little bit of sharpness compared to our fixed or prime lenses. And fast lenses are very wide aperture lenses like f2.8s, f1.8s tend to be sharper. And we're going to have a look at that in just a moment as to exactly why that is. But just a term that you need to become familiar with landscape photography, and indeed with photography in general, but will be applied a lot to landscape photography, is our plane of focus. Okay, now the plane of focus is very simple to understand. It is simply the point that we focus on. So any object that you focus on, whether it's a person, whether it's a tree off in the distance, that object that you choose to focus on is where your plane of focus is. And this is the sharpest point in the photograph. Depth of field extends from this point. Take a look at the picture here on the right. We can very, very clearly see the area in this photograph that's sharp. That is our plane of focus. Everything on front of it, everything behind it is out of focus because the depth of field extends from this point. So roughly in the middle of that budding young cornfield is where our plane of focus is. It's the point we chose to focus on, and the depth of field extends around that. Let's have a look at this. So basically, we have our camera, we have our tree, we decide to focus on the tree, and the point that we choose to focus from is where our plane of focus extends from. Okay, so this is our point of focus, and that red line that's kind of extending from that, that's our plane of focus. It's parallel to our camera's sensor. Depth of field extends from that point. That is where our depth of field is extending from. And remember, depth of field is about 1/3 in front of the subject and then 2/3 behind the subject. Now, why is this important? Well, it's going to become very, very important when we start talking about how to get sharper landscapes. Why f22 isn't the aperture that you should be using when capturing a landscape. And this relates to something you may have come across, certainly a term that's used very, very frequently online, which is the sweet spot, or lens's sweet spot. And again, to simplify this, the sweet spot in our lens lens is the aperture setting that we can use to get the sharpest results. Okay, now you can see there on screen there is a rule of thumb that it's 3 stops from the widest aperture. So if you're using a lens that starts at f2.8, typically f8 is going to be the sharpest aperture to use. So all this, if this is a new thing to you, it might be a little bit confusing to and it might be a little bit of a surprise to realize that f22 is not going to be your sharpest aperture. It will give you the deepest depth of field, but it actually isn't going to give you the sharpest photograph, and we're going to have a look at why that is. So when we photograph at f22, we experience something called diffraction. When we stop down our apertures to a higher f-stop number, finer details are going to blur. Now, this is down to physics, and it's due to the waves of light. They're shifted when they're passing through such a small opening. And for this reason, f22 will not yield the sharpest results. So if we just have a look at these cross sections here, so you can see when we're photographing at f2.8, the light rays are coming in pretty much straight in onto the sensor. We come in at f8, you can see that those light waves are beginning to get a little bit distorted, but not to the point where it actually causes any loss of sharpness. In fact, it gives us a sharper photograph. But when we go to the other extreme, when we go to f22, those light waves are actually being shifted by the aperture blades. The opening becomes so small that it produces a less sharp photograph, particularly on the finer details. And here's an example. So we have our range here going from soft. And this is a 50-cent coin that was shot with an f2.8 Canon lens, 40mm f2.8 Canon lens. As we would expect, shooting an f2.8, everything is soft. We can see particularly on the edges of the photograph, or of the coin even, that we've got softness there, especially in the finer details. As we move up, things are beginning to get a lot sharper. Now remember, as a rule of thumb, we mentioned that the sharpest or the sweet spot generally is about 3 stops up from your widest aperture. And indeed, have a look at these photographs here, f8 and f11. We can see that the details, particularly on the font, on the text here, on the 50-cent coin, is much, much sharper than when we were at f2.8. But if we continue on, we start to experience diffraction, and we can see that we begin to lose sharpness. Now, it's nowhere near as severe as when we're photographing at f2.8, but it has lost the finer detail, and this can become quite pronounced if you're photographing something, a landscape that has a lot of texture in it, like say desert sand, or say trees, light coming through the trees. You will definitely lose sharpness there. So you want to be photographing at your f8 or your f11. Now, at this stage, you might be asking yourself then, well, if I'm photographing at f8 or f11 and that's my sharpest aperture, how can I get the full depth of field? The depth of field isn't going to be the same as if I was photographing on f22. So how can I get the sharpness? And this is where distance comes in to play as well. As we've begun to see it with our portrait photography, and we're definitely going to see it a lot more, especially with our macro photography. Distance does play a big part on the depth of field effect in our photographs. Let's say we are photographing a subject in a landscape, and this person is at varying distances in each of these landscapes. We're going to use the same aperture setting for each of these scenarios. We're going to photograph at f11 because, as we've just established, f11, perhaps in this particular lens, is our sweet spot. That's going to give us the sharpest photograph. But how can I get the best depth of field here? F11, if I photograph my subject and they're quite close to me, so I photograph on them, there's the plane of focus, I've focused on them, my depth of field extends around them roughly 1/3 in front of the subject and 2/3 behind the subject. But everything else in this photograph, all of this is not going to be sharp. I'm going to have a shallow depth field effect, even though I am photographing at a fairly mid-ranged aperture. In the second example, our subject is further away. Again, we focus on this person. The depth of field extends around them. It still extends 1/3 to 2/3 behind them, but because they're further away from the camera, because the distance is greater, the depth of field range is bigger as well. So more of the photograph is going to be in focus. Now, stuff that's still in the front of the picture and behind the picture is going to be out of focus. There is still a range, but if I move the subject even further away, that depth of field effect becomes even greater. So the further away my subject is, the bigger the depth of field effect is going to be. But it will get to a stage where if the subject gets too far away, then everything in the front of the photograph is not going to be sharp. So how can I make sure that I can get everything sharp? I can't photograph at f22 because I'm going to get diffraction. If I photograph at f11 or f8, which is my sharpest aperture, I'm not going to get the full depth of field effect. Well, this is where arguably one of the most complicated parts of photography comes into play, but hopefully I've made it as straightforward to understand as possible, is our hyperfocal distance. Now, if you are getting into your landscape photography in a very intense way, you will need to learn about hyperfocal distance. If landscape photography for you is just something that you want to get better at, everything that we've looked at so far will improve your landscape photography. One thing, as a rule of thumb, when it comes to focusing and using an aperture of f8, f11, f16, if you focus about 1/3 of a way into the photograph, it should produce sharp results for you, with that idea that you're photographing at the sweet spot and that you've got that enough distance there that your depth of field will make everything look sharp. If you want to ensure sharpness, you will need to learn the hyperfocal distance and the hyperfocal point. And basically, to summarize it, it's a distance which all objects can be brought into what we call acceptable focus. Basically, we can make sure everything is sharp. Hyperfocal distance is the focus distance giving the maximum depth of field. The maximum depth of field that we can get from our aperture. Let's try to break this down and make it a little bit more easier to understand. Okay, the hyperfocal distance is where we can focus in a scene to maximize sharpness in a photograph. It is determined by 3 factors: aperture, focal length, and the size of your sensor. So you need to, first of all, choose what aperture you're going to be shooting at, as basically determining what the sweet spot is in the lens. What focal length you're photographing at is going to make a difference as well, and then the size of our camera sensor too. So how do we work out the hyperfocal distance? How do we find that point that we want to focus on in the landscape to make everything as sharp as possible? Well, there's a couple of ways that we can do this, okay? There are charts available online. There's loads of them online. You can simply download them and they have everything worked out for you already, which makes life a lot easier. Working out the hyperfocal distance by yourself can be a little bit tricky, but how we would work it out is you will need a lens that have a distance scale. So if you've ever seen that distance scale on a lens, you've wondered what it is to do with the hyperfocal distance. So basically, older lenses, you'll see it on nearly every older lens. We would use manual focus. We twist the focus until the distance scale shows us the proper distance according to the scale on the top of the lens. So we use our chart to find out our hyperfocal point, the distance that we want to photograph on. Then we use our manual focus to change the distance scale until we get that distance that is indicated on the chart. Now, if you don't have a distance scale, and you can still do this, but you're going to have to basically guesstimate. You're going to have to try and approximate this through your viewfinder. You can use your chart, and you can have a look through the viewfinder, and you can use your, you can try to figure out the distance yourself. There is a much easier way to do this. There's loads of apps out there to help you on this. Very straightforward to use apps, okay? So there's a list of them here. You can try Simple Depth of Field Master, TacSharp. There's loads of different ones out there that you could have a look at. They all work the same way. You input your camera model, you put the lens in that you're using and the aperture setting that you're going to use, and the app will tell you what distance you should set your focus at to get the hyperfocal point. Now, you're still going to have to guesstimate, where that is if you don't have the distance scale, but it should give you a good approximation. Now, as I said, as a rule of thumb, you can photograph about 1/3 into the way of the scene, focus 1/3 of the way into the scene with your f8, with your f11, and this should also give you acceptable results. Now, hopefully that has explained the hyperfocal distance for you. It is a complex subject for basic photographers, for expert photographers. It's something that, to be honest, I wouldn't ever really use that often myself. But if you really want to make landscape photography a career for yourself and you want to get the most from it, you will need to learn more about the hyperfocal distance. But we will park that for now as we are getting close to the end of the lesson. And there's just one final thing that I want to mention quite briefly, which is high dynamic range. And high dynamic range is HDR, something I'm sure that you're all familiar with, as it's become fairly much a standard setting in our cameras, in our phones, as a way to get better exposures. So one thing we haven't really touched on in this lesson is exposure for landscape photography. Now, we will be having a look at it when we speak about our filters. We have an entire lesson on high dynamic range coming up in a future module as well, but I do want to mention it briefly. So if we are out there photographing, we capture a scene like this. We've got lots and lots of detail here in this photograph, lots of detail in the foreground, lots of detail in the background. We have no areas that are over or underexposed. In reality, when we're photographing a scene like this, what we have is a photograph that has two extremes in dynamic range. I want you to imagine yourself in this scenario, as it's something that you are going to come across again and again in landscape photography. If we expose a scene like this, we decide that we want to make sure that our sky is not going to be overexposed. We adjust our settings to make sure that the sky is not overexposed, but then we end up with an underexposed foreground. So we take the shot, so we expose for the highlights, and basically exposing for the highlights, that means we want to ensure that we're not losing any details in the brightest parts of the photograph. However, what that means is that we're going to have much darker details in the darkest parts of the photograph to the point where it becomes underexposed. The opposite then, and I'm sure this